Chapter 12. Sue and Michelle came straight home after work. The talk began immediately. Sue was moving slowly and hard to read. Michelle, however, was acting like she'd just drunk a 1-gallon red-eye coffee with an extra shot of espresso just for the hell of it. They were both ready to get started. Rob Bree explained the plan. Sue and Michelle were to stay in the doorway of the apartment. That door was to be left wide open. All the lights in the living room and kitchen would be left on, every single lamp and overhead. If there was a bulb in it, it was to be blazing. That was all they had to do. That, and be ready to run. Michelle asked him what he was going to be doing exactly. All he said was that he was going to call them. He didn't go into the specifics with her. She and Sue didn't really need to know all about that part of it. All he wanted them to worry about was how fast their legs could carry them, just in case. It began. He made sure all the lights outside the door were on. Michelle had flicked on the living room overhead, and that started the ceiling fan spinning. There was no way to turn that light on without that happening. It was a malfunction that they had not been able to figure out how to fix. The super of the building was no help whatsoever. Rob guessed it probably didn't get annoying until the wintertime when they really needed to see, maybe to look for something, and they had to have those damn blades spinning, making it even colder. The lighting of the lamps alone was less harsh and more atmospheric, so that was what they generally used anyway. Rob shook his head, realizing his stress level. His mind always wandered like that whenever he was nearing an overload point. He told himself to stay calm. Sue had turned on the overhead fluorescent in the kitchen, which took a few seconds to stop flickering and stabilize. Then she and Michelle took their positions by the open front door. He went to the closed door to Sue's dark bedroom. He could have used Michelle's room, but he felt like they already knew their way to this one, like the way lightning follows the same path of broken air. They smiled at each other humorlessly and nodded to signal that they were ready, and it was time to get started. Sue had explained everything to Michelle in the car while it was warming up in the lot at work. She had carried the forthcoming event with her all through her shift. She wanted to spare Michelle the burden until they were off the clock. The whole conversation took less than 10 minutes. Michelle had been very receptive and asked very few questions. Sue had told her of the things they could use in case the monsters really did come, such as light and the lack of solitude. That was why they had to be there, not just for support, but to let their presence possibly be a weapon itself, or maybe some sort of prevention. The lights were another just-in-case aspect. Nothing was absolutely defined or completely understood. Michelle accepted that, all with a kind of thrill. Rob turned to enter the room. He paused in the entranceway and turned to look at them. "You guys don't have to do this if you don't want to," he said, knowing it was all too late for that. He hated himself for not meaning it. He wondered if they could hear it in his voice. He tried his best to sound sincere. Was he really putting his own selfish motives before what he thought could potentially be their very lives? Still, he had to go on. "It's okay. We can do this if you still want to," Sue said. Rob breathed and said, "I do. I need to know." "I think we all do," Michelle added. "Okay, here goes." Rob's face suddenly looked very intent. He was focused. "Be careful," Sue said loudly. He turned his head and said, "I will." Then he added, "You guys be careful too." He then went on, "If anything does happen, I want you to run regardless. If I really get in trouble, don't be stupid. Got it?" They just stared at him with furrowed brows. He turned his whole body to them. "Got it? I'm not doing this if I have to add worrying about you guys to this." He was stalling a bit through his sincerity. "We'll be safe," Sue said. "And smart, we promise," Michelle finished. Damn it a bit. Now he would have to go through with it. "Good." Rob turned back away from them and towards the door again. He entered the room and closed the door gently behind him. He stood just 3 feet inside the room and waited for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. In about a minute he figured he'd be able to see just fine with the shafts of light coming through the Venetian blinds. They created stripes of luminescence on the opposing wall. He was feeling even more anxious with each passing second. Did he even need to call for them to come? He knew he didn't, not after the other night. They would come, invited or not. He'd better be prepared. He assumed the position. He turned around and faced the closed door. He looked down at the light pouring in from underneath it. He saw his legs cutting 2 gaps in the glow. He asked himself just what the hell it was he was doing. "Just how crazy am I?" he asked himself quietly in the dark. He placed his right hand, flat-palmed, on the wall just under the light switch. He would only have to jerk his arm upward and his fingers would flick them into the harsh brightness. His left hand grabbed the doorknob. He felt those knuckles whitening in the dark. His night vision had kicked in. He knew it was stupid, but he had to check the top latch to make sure it hadn't latched itself. It hadn't. His eyes darted around the room, pausing in each nook and cranny. He was steadily panning his head back and forth, looking over his shoulder. As much as he felt they didn't need an invite to come, he felt he couldn't be looking directly at any area where they might come from, like it could only happen in his periphery. He had to twist his torso without removing his hands from their positions to try to eliminate any blind spots. He did that for almost 4 minutes, although he felt it had been much longer.
Everything okay?
He jumped at the voice that muffled its way into the room. She sounded so far away. She was still by the front door. That was good. "Yeah, Sue, it's fine. Nothing yet," he answered back through the door. "I need a little more time." He realized he had taken his eyes off the room for a few seconds. He jerked his head around, and there it was, in the corner. He let out a short scream, and without taking his eyes off of it, he flicked on the overhead bulbs. They were blindingly bright. His pupils contracted to almost pinpoints. It was gone. "What the hell?" he said.
Rod? Rod!
Sue was calling out. "Hang on," he yelled back. "Just wait by the door, it's nothing." Then more quietly he added, "I think." Their neighbor from across the hall came out of her door right across from where Sue and Michelle were standing. They both jumped and cried out at the sound of her door when it creaked open. The neighbor paused. She just stood there, in her robe, holding a trash bag in each hand, and stared at them. After a moment, the elderly lady's stillness broke, and she trotted down the hall to the garbage chute. "Damn kids," they heard her mutter as she came shuffling back in her fuzzy pink slippers, shaking her head. "Have a good night, Mrs. Cranston," Michelle said to her in a smarmy tone as the woman entered her apartment. She gave them a disapproving glare and shut her door hard. Sue lightly backhanded Michelle on her hip. "Stop it," she said. "What? I'm just being neighborly," Michelle offered. They quietly giggled at each other. Rob was confused. He didn't care about trying to catch them off guard anymore. They would have to meet him somewhat on his own set of terms, too, which would be head-on. Without taking his eyes off of where it had been, he reached out behind him and his left hand searched for the light switch. He found the switch and slid it down. The room went completely dark all over again. His pupils slowly began to widen. If a hand reached out and grabbed his unsupervised arm, he knew he would never get over it. There it was again, appearing on the wall. It was a shadow from outside. How had he mistaken it as even remotely man or monster-shaped? He could maybe see how, he thought for a second. No, it was still quite a stretch. He was just freaking himself out. He shakily laughed in relief. What the hell was making that shadow? He walked over to the window and slid his fingers between the blinds at eye level. He crinkled 3 of the blinds downward and peered out into the night. A bush. All that adrenaline for a fucking misshapen bush. The streetlight had just morphed the shadow to be more odd-looking than it really was. Oh shit, I'm doing it again, he thought. He wasn't constantly watching the room. That was going to get real exhausting real fast. It was certainly no way to live. The feeling gave him all the more reason to really go on through with it. He ran back over to his place by the door. He immediately scoped the room. He didn't see anything out of place, but he was still too worked up to let out a sigh. He needed to stay prepared. How was he fucking up something so simple? He wondered if Sue and Michelle were having this much trouble staying where they were supposed to be. As if she heard his thoughts, Sue said,
"You still okay in there, Rod?"
"Yes." He could tell she was still in her place. He was starting to feel silly and was pretty sure that their tension was starting to go lax as well. You could only stay amped up for so long without any payoff. Then he feared that was when the stupid movie moments happened. Michelle would tell Sue that she was thirsty and that she was just going to grab a soda from the fridge, not knowing the monsters had already killed him, and while she was deciding between Pepsi or Mountain Dew, the killer's hand would appear from behind her with a knife and slash her throat, having already slashed Sue's in the doorway. Blood would splatter all over the chilled leftovers and stain the linoleum floor. Some jackass in the back row would yell something about not wanting to be the one to clean that up. He shook off that thought. He said aloud, "All right, no more fucking around." He was afraid that a small part of him wanted them to come just so he wouldn't look stupid. Was he actually wishing for them to come, wishing for it all to be true? He stood back again where he had when he first entered the room, but with his back to the door instead. He could watch the room. He felt self-conscious for some reason, but he was alone after all. He placed his right hand on his crotch and hummed. He didn't know what note he was humming. He was not musically trained, but a chorus teacher in high school told him he was a baritone, and he could hit some pretty low ones. Whatever note it was, he could feel it working. His entire body broke out in goosebumps, all his hairs pricked up. He hummed that note as steadily as he could until he was almost out of breath. He guessed it had gone on for about 30 seconds. Then he turned back around and assumed his original position in the room again. He was ready with the lights, and he was ready to run, and he was ready for his confirmation. He waited and listened. A new wave of fear was washing over him. He heard one quick, loud cracking sound. It was here. It's really here, he thought, as he looked around more frantically, starting to pant. He saw nothing, though. He waited another moment, but then panicked. He flicked on the light. Still, he saw nothing. He turned to examine the room. His breathing began to slow. His eyebrows were pulled together in disappointed disbelief. The good news is, he thought, is that they're not real. The bad news is, I'm absolutely crazy. It's good that I've gone mad, he said to no one. It's really good. None of this is real. He let out a half-laugh, half-cry. Then he pulled himself together. He opened the door and purposely left the light on in the room. Sue and Michelle were looking at him. Well? Sue asked. Her voice trembled a bit. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. I'm just a loon. No, you're not, she said through a sigh. She and Michelle came all the way inside and closed the front door. What was that sound? Michelle asked. It sounded like something broke. I don't know, Rob said. I thought it was them, but there's nothing wrong in there. He gestured toward Sue's room. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I need a drink, Michelle said. I'll drink to that, Sue replied, sounding tired. Here, here, Rob contributed. The kitchen was between them. He walked through the living room to meet them. He walked around the back of the sofa and passed by the door to Michelle's room, when it was suddenly thrown open and a dark gray, muscular arm reached out and grabbed the back of his shirt. It pulled him into her unlit room. He got his right hand to grab the doorframe and his fingers latched onto the jamb. He yelled out. Sue came running towards the door. Michelle dropped her glass she had just picked up a second before and it shattered on the floor. She came running after Sue, not knowing what was going on. She saw Sue grab Rob's upper arm and start pulling. Sue and Rob were both crying and yelling. Michelle was completely frozen for a moment, just watching all of it. She could see that Rob was lifted off the ground and someone had their thick arm around his midsection. The room was dark and neither Sue nor Rob was in the position to turn on the light. She, without thinking, grabbed one of the lamps from the little side tables by the sofa and turned it sideways. The top of the shade was pointing into the room and she was using it like a spotlight. It first landed on Rob, and she quickly traveled the circle of light onto the thing. It had no face. It dropped Rob and put its arms up in an X to try to shield its head and upper body from the 60-watt glow. It shook its head in an irritated fashion and ran off to the other side of the room, where the light could not follow unless she got closer. There was no way in hell she was going to do that. Rob was on the floor coughing and gasping and clawing his way into the living room. Sue got him by the arms and pulled him up. She yanked him, running, with one arm and grabbed Michelle's sleeve with the other. Together they ran to the front door. Sue flicked the lock open so fast that she barely missed a beat. She pulled the door closed behind her out of habit and it slammed shut. Hopefully it would stay shut. They ran down the flights of stairs looking up to make sure they weren't being chased. They got to the car. Rob got in the back. Sue drove and Michelle rode shotgun. Sue went the speed limit, knowing rationally that it wasn't going to catch up to them at that point. Rob had clasped his hands together behind his head and brought his elbows together, squeezing his face. He was saying over and over, "It's real. It's all real." He was rocking back and forth. Michelle turned around in her seat to face him. "Rob? Rob!" she yelled. She got no response. She grabbed his wrists in her hands and pried them away from his face. "Stop it!" she shouted when she was finally able to make eye contact. He did stop it. He exhaled a long, seemingly cleansing breath. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm okay. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. We're all fine." "Sue?" he asked, despite what Michelle had just said. "I'm fine, Rob. Just take it easy, okay?" she responded without taking her eyes off the road. "Okay." He was suddenly extremely calm. He sat back against the seat and went limp. They drove for nearly half an hour before stopping at a 24-hour donut shop.